Right now, as I make this video, everyone is still losing their damn minds over the new Fender Standard Series guitars. Made in Indonesia, these represent the first time that a guitar with a Fender name on the headstock has been made overseas, east of the USA or Mexico. As long as you don't count all of the ones that have been made in Japan. Indonesia is where many of Fender's cheaper Squier guitars are made, alongside mid-priced instruments from almost every other guitar brand on the planet. I haven't played these new standard models yet, but I do have a Mexican player Strat and an Indonesian Squier. Both are extremely nice guitars for their price point, and I have no reason so far to doubt that the standard models will, as intended, fall somewhere between these two in terms of quality. But because Squier is made in Indonesia, the standards have attracted quite a bit of controversy about this potentially being a cost-cutting measure that cheapens the Fender brand, watering down the quality that the continental American guitars are known for. Now, while this seems like a very 2025 complaint, it's not the first time Fender have made changes to their product line that has elicited such a vitriolic reaction. I just bought this. It's a 1980 Fender International Series Stratocaster in Capri orange with a hardtail bridge. This represents the very last of the 1970 style Strats, with the huge headstocks and the 3-bolt neck plates. These now have a bit of a cult following, particularly the hardtail versions. They are a quirky, retro twist on the classic Strat formula, and for people like me who didn't live through the 70s, these offer a relatively inexpensive way to own a vintage Fender. However, for people who did live through the 70s, these are still largely regarded as the worst guitars Fender ever made. And much like the Indonesian standard models of today, I think a lot of that hate is probably overplayed and unjustified. This industry is so nostalgically backwards looking that it tends to treat any deviation from tradition as a personal attack. To keep the history brief, in 1965, Leo Fender sold the Fender brand to the CBS Corporation, who made a number of changes to the manufacturing of the guitars in an effort to make their production more cost-effective. Things like changing over from Nitro to poly finishes, changing over all the plastics to ABS, changes to the body contouring on certain models, bridge materials changed, pickups changed, and in the 70s they made some very bold moves with larger headstocks to make the logo more visible and a 3-bolt adjustable neck plate. Many of these changes are now standard processes in guitar manufacturing and cut costs purely by allowing a quicker and more consistent manufacturing process without adversely affecting the quality of the product. But things were different, and therefore worse, so guitarists to this day still talk about the CBS era Fenders as if they were all garbage that would literally fall apart in your hands. Now, I don't have a golden era 50s Strat to compare this one to, and I bought this completely blind. I have no idea of the quality of this 45-year-old instrument. I can already see a few things that will need to be replaced or repaired, so let's give it a look over so I know what replacement parts I need to order. Let's start off by discussing the weight, because this is an unbelievably heavy guitar. This is a solid ash body, something fairly common for the late 70s Strats, and if you're familiar with the body contouring on a normal Stratocaster, it feels like they forgot to include it entirely. It has a much reduced tummy cut and elbow cut, meaning that this already weighty body has even more mass than you'd expect. Add the hardtail into the mix, meaning we don't have a rear cavity cutout removing material, and this Strat rivals the back-breaking load of a Les Paul. This Strat is a prime example of the kind of finish inconsistency you can expect from CBS era Fender. As is typical, you'll see that the face of the headstock is significantly darker and more yellowed than the rest of the neck. This is because the back of the neck is a thick poly finish. But poly would have melted the headstock decals, so Nitro was used for the front of the headstock only. So even in 1980, they were still using both poly and Nitro finishes depending on application. Although by this time, most standard guitar body colours, the blacks, the sunbursts, the wine reds, etc., were done in poly. But this isn't a standard colour. The International Series was a limited run of special bright colours, and as you can see from the playware here, this Capri orange is most likely Nitro. Poly finishes simply don't wear in this way, and we can prove that because under this Capri orange is a thick poly clear coat which has suffered no damage whatsoever. So this is an ash body sprayed with a thick clear poly and then sprayed again with orange nitro, which makes perfect sense when you consider what this guitar really is. Natural ash was a very popular finish in the 70s Strat lineup, and the International Series guitars were really just resprays to try and shift excess stock at the end of the decade in order to make way for the new 80s designs. Taking one look at these frets, I can tell they're not original. These are far too tall and fresh for one, and there's evidence of chip out in the fingerboard along the fret slots and some breaks in the finish around the fret edges. This is a pretty recent refret, which honestly is a good sign. This guitar would have been played to the point where the frets wore out and someone spent the time and money to get it professionally refretted. That's not something you do if the guitar is garbage. A refret on an old instrument usually is a sign that it's worth playing. The edge dressing is not quite up to my standard, but I can easily rebevel and dress the frets. I'm just glad that the hard part has already been done for me. This is the original nut, and it is completely cooked. Now that should be expected considering the refret. The slots in this were cut deeper and deeper to keep up with the worn frets, and then when the new frets were put in, they shimmed the nut up higher to compensate. However, they've done that by flooding the nut slot full of superglue, letting it harden, and then placing the original nut back on top. I think the better course of action would have been to make a new, taller nut to go along with the new frets, so I'll add a bone blank to my shopping cart and carve a new one. Looks like I'll also have to replace a few of the bridge saddle height adjustment Grub screws. At least 2 of them have been stripped out and one of them has debris jammed in the hex head. It's clear that this has been an issue for a while because the previous owner has damaged the saddles in an attempt to adjust these. There's also a lot of rust on the screws, which might be binding everything in place, and it looks like a few of the intonation adjustment screws have been chewed up as well. You should be using the right size of screwdriver to avoid that. This bridge is not fully functional at this time, but fortunately it won't take much work to salvage it. We have 3 single coil pickups with flat magnets, which was the style at the time. I'm curious to discover if all of this is original, and it should be a simple case of lifting the pick guard to find out. Yep, everything looks original and intact. By 1980, Fender had gone back to using plastic pickup bobbins, which are represented here. All of the wires look undisturbed, and they connect back to the original pots and switch. A fully shielded pick guard, dimple-back CTS pots and a ceramic disc tone capacitor are all expected for a late 70s spec Strat. The pot codes date this to 1980, as does the cavity sticker, so despite the serial number on the headstock still referencing 1979, it was almost a year into the next decade before this rolled off the production line. To recap then, this Strat needs a new nut, a little fretwork, the bridge needs repaired, a deep clean, some fresh strings and a setup. I'll away and order those parts, but for now let's get an idea of how it sounds prior to restoration. I think this is a bad guitar that deserves all the hate? Well, obviously not. It's a very well-made guitar that stood the test of time. A poor quality instrument would not have survived this long or been played this much. The sounds from it are great, if quite specific to the era it's from, but I can see where some of the stranger design choices put people off at the time. It doesn't feel or even really sound like a traditional Stratocaster. It's very different to the image a lot of people will have in their heads when they think of a Strat. The weight and the lack of contouring particularly would have been a deal breaker for a lot of people. I happen to like heavy guitars, so this is not an issue for me. The 3-bolt neck plate was a huge problem for people at the time. The idea is that the bottom machine bolt can be loosened and a small grub screw can pitch the neck back if needed. People talk about sloppy neck pockets on these guitars. This pocket was gripping the neck just fine with none of the bolts in, and it looks very well machined and toleranced. I think what people are mistaking for sloppy work are these circular cutouts in the corners of the neck pocket, which you don't see on earlier Strats. But these aren't mistakes. This is intentional and needs to be there to allow the micro tilt system to function. If there wasn't additional room at the corners of the neck pocket, the neck would get stuck when trying to adjust the tilt. I think the 3-bolt neck might be a very misunderstood piece of innovation, people really just looking back at what was and not understanding the new changes that were being made. Do I think you should buy one of these? Absolutely not. I could have had several very nice, brand new, Indonesian-made guitars for the money I spent on this. If you want a Strat, just get a modern Strat. Any of them will be superior to this guitar. You see, in 1980, Fender had only been making Strats for 26 years. I know that seems like a long time, but they'd only just figured out to put a 5-way switch on them 3 years before this. There's been a further 45 years of perfecting this formula and improvements to manufacturing processes to offer quality and consistency. Even the best of vintage Fender would not stand up to many of the guitars being manufactured today, simply because we're better at making guitars now. Vintage guitars are only better in the sense that they let you own a little piece of history. I can play this late 70s style Strat and convince myself I can write a riff as iconic as anything Ritchie Blackmore churned out because I'm using the same equipment he did. That's delusional, but I enjoy exploring the process, and spending time with an old, well-played instrument is a completely different experience to buying something brand new. Both of those have their merits, of course, but if I'm being very honest with myself, one of those new Indonesian Fenders with a few upgrades would probably be a more sensible use of my money. If you want to see this 1980 Capri Strat go through its renovation, then do make sure you are subscribed. That video will happen once all the new parts land with me. That's all for now though. Keep it loud and stay safe.